Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 539, and today is February 5th, 2024. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. We got a lot of news to talk about on today's show. A couple major weapon sales announcements from the U.S. government, news on the U.S. strikes in Iraq and Syria, and also the Israeli genocide going on in Gaza. So please share today's show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com. You can watch the video version at YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee. It's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts, and you can follow all the work that I put out. Last week, I think I wrote upwards of 15 articles. I did 5 podcasts. I was also on Judge Andrew Napolitano's show, Judging Freedom. So, pretty busy week last week. I put out a lot of stuff, and all that comes out on my Twitter feed at @KyleAnslone_. All right, now let's get into today's news. All right, first up here, this one from Reuters. Zelensky informs White House he will fire commander of Ukrainian forces. So Reuters reports the Ukrainian government has informed the White House that it plans to fire the country's top military commander overseeing the war against Russia and occupation forces, two knowledgeable sources said Friday. The move to oust General Zaluzhny, who has clashed with President Zelensky over military strategy and other issues following a Ukrainian counteroffensive last year that failed to recover significant amounts of Russian-held territory. A source close to Zelensky's office said the pair have also disagreed over a new military mobilization drive, with the president opposing Zaluzhny's proposal for up to 500,000 fresh troops. The source, however, added that the process for relieving Zaluzhny of his post as Commander-in-Chief's armed forces was on hold for the time being, as officials consider who his replacement should be. I have read that one of the issues here is none of the more popular pits to replace Zaluzhny have wanted to take on the job, and so this has put Zelensky in a little bit of a bind. If you gotta, pick someone unpopular to replace Zaluzhny, then this is going to look more unpopular for Zelensky, who's less popular than Zaluzhny among Ukrainians. I also think the arguments here are interesting, right? Because Zelensky has a far more ambitious war aim. He's talking about still driving the Russians out of all Ukrainian territory, going back to the post-Soviet borders in Ukraine. That includes Crimea, that includes the Donbass, not just the 2 southern regions that Russia has taken, whereas the Zelensky seem to have a far more realistic view of the war and what Ukraine could achieve, which is mainly just holding on to the territory it has now and not losing more territory, as the Russian forces are currently slowly advancing. And so Zaluzhny has wanted to call up far more troops than Zelensky, who of course has the more moderate war aim, which, is an interesting comparison there. So right now in Ukraine, I believe the actual draft age for all men is 27. Now, if you've already been in the military, that the draft age is 18. And so they want to drop the draft age down a few years, 25, 24 maybe, and that's going to add these 500,000 fresh troops. And Zelensky has been hesitant to do it because it's not going to be a politically popular move in Ukraine. All right, next up here, Russia says Ukraine killed 28 in shelling a bakery with U.S.-provided HIMARS. This from Day to Camp, antiwar.com, February 4th. Russia said on Sunday that at least 28 people were killed in the Ukrainian shelling of a bakery in a city in the Russian-controlled Luhansk Oblast in eastern Ukraine. The bakery was hit on Saturday afternoon, and the death toll rose as emergency workers searched through the rubble overnight. According to Reuters, local officials said the strike was carried out by Ukrainian forces using U.S.-provided HIMARS rocket systems. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman said the strike was carried out with Western weapons. According to preliminary information, the strike was carried out with Western weapons, she said. She added that the strike was a terrorist attack and said the European Union citizens should know their taxes are being used to send weapons to Ukraine used to kill civilians. Ukrainian attacks inside Russian-controlled Ukraine and inside Russian territory have increased as it has become clear Ukrainian forces can't gain territory. Last month, Ukrainian artillery shelling killed 27 at a market in the Russian-controlled portion of the Donetsk Oblast. Later in January, Kiev downed a Russian military transport plane in Russia's Belgorod Oblast that Moscow says was carrying dozens of Ukrainian prisoners of war. Russian President Putin said Ukraine used U.S.-provided Patriot missiles to shoot down the plane. Now, this is something that we have been talking about on this show for really the past year, that this was something that was going to uptick, particularly as the counteroffensive wasn't going well over the summer. Once in the fall, we realized that the counteroffensive had completely failed. And then at the end of last year, we talked about this being a part of the Ukrainian strategy for this coming year, was more attacks on, targets inside of either Russian territory, Russian annexed territory, or Russian controlled territory in Ukraine. And, not only that, but hitting civilian targets like we're seeing here. All right, a couple major weapon sales to talk about next. U.S. approves hundreds of Hellfire missiles to the Netherlands. The Defense Security Cooperation Agency said the State Department has made a determination approving the possible foreign military sale to the government of the Netherlands of Hellfire missiles and related equipment for the estimated cost of $150 million. The Defense Security Cooperation Agency delivered the required certification notifying Congress of the possible sale today. The government of the Netherlands has requested to buy up to 386 Hellfire air-to-ground missiles, and also includes is U.S. Army Air Aviation and Military Command Security Assistance Management Directorate Technical Assistance, and just some other help, that the Netherlands will get in carrying out these attacks. The primary principal contractor will be Lockheed Martin. And so, one thing somebody asked on Twitter when I posted this story was, do I think this is like some kind of CIA scheme to get more weapons to Ukraine? With the idea here is that you either transfer these weapons to the Netherlands, and then the Netherlands will transfer these weapons to Ukraine, or you sell these weapons to the Netherlands, and that frees up the Netherlands to transfer other older weapons to Ukraine. I mean, I don't, it's certainly possible that that's what's happening here. I just want to mention that that's openly been going on. It's not like the CIA would really have to do it. That's just been kind of the open White House policy of weapon sales to Europe. All right, we're also looking at here, State Department approves $4 billion drone sale to India. The Defense Security Cooperation Agency statement said the State Department has made the determination approving a possible foreign military sale to the government of India of MQ-9B remotely piloted aircraft and related equipment at an estimated cost of $3.99 billion. The government of India has requested to buy 31 MQ-9B Sky Guardian aircraft, 161 embedded global positioning and integration navigation systems, and then a lot of other related equipment and munitions for those drones. The principal contractor will be General Atomics. So major weapon sale to India here. Next up of this article I wrote for antiwar.com on February 2nd, Israel announces it will attack Gaza border city of Rafah. Around 1.5 million Palestinians have fled other areas of Gaza and are now in Rafah. The head of the Israeli Defense Ministry has declared victory over the city of Khan Yunis and vowed his forces would attack Rafah next. Rafah is the last city in Gaza not completely destroyed by the ongoing Israeli military campaign. About 75% of the Strip's population is currently sheltering in that city. And that 75% is a rough number. The estimates I have seen range from 1.5 million to 1.5 million people have fled there, and the pre-war population was 250,000, so that puts us between 1.7 and 1.8 million. But I don't think anybody really knows. It's not really possible to conduct a census of how many Palestinians are living in Rafah. On Thursday, the Israeli Defense Minister Gallant said Israel is winning in Khan Yunis, and the Israeli Defense Forces will move on to Rafah next. We are achieving our mission in Khan Yunis, and we will reach Rafah and eliminate the terrorist elements that threaten us, he declared. When Israel began its military campaign in Gaza, it ordered all Palestinians to leave the northern half of the Gaza Strip. Most of the internally displaced Gazans fled to Khan Yunis, the largest city in the southern half of the Strip. Now, following the IDF bombardment of the city, most residents and refugees have fled, many to Rafah. The last remaining city and refugee camp in Gaza is Rafah, a city along the enclave's border with Egypt. Before the war, Rafah was home to 2,500, a 250,000 people. Currently, 1.7 million Palestinians are packed into the city. A UN spokesperson for the Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs explained, Rafah is now a pressure cooker of despair, and we fear for what happens next. UN official James McGoldrick said earlier this month, as soon as you arrive in Rafah, it hits you straight away is the immensity of the people who are displaced, every street, every pavement. They have also these makeshift tents built onto the sides of building, encroaching on the roads. It's very hard to move around. This place is really, really packed. A reporter for Al Jazeera who was in Rafah said Palestinians are in disbelief at Gallant's declaration and wondering where to go. The reporter said, now this is the statement by the Israeli defense minister. It seems they will have no other place to go. People will not be able to find proper civilian infrastructure to depend on if they return back to the areas. It seems that we will have more death among civilians. It's unclear where Israel expects the Palestinians to go. Since the start of the conflict, the IDF has barred Palestinians from returning to areas Israel has conquered. Even if Palestinians were allowed to return, much of the infrastructure has been destroyed. Haaretz reports the IDF has even ordered soldiers to burn down Palestinian homes when they withdraw from an area. Gallant has claimed that Israel needs to attack Rafah to rescue hostages held by Hamas. He said, the great pressure that the forces exert on Hamas targets bring us closer to the return of abductees more than anything else. We will continue until the end. There is no other way. The IDF has yet to rescue a single hostage through its military operations in Gaza. The IDF has killed several hostages, including 3 who escaped and were waving white flags when they were shot by snipers. Hamas has offered to release hostages if Israel allows ends the war in Gaza and allows aid into the besieged Strip. The IDF has killed at least 27,000 Palestinians in Gaza, including 11,500 children in the past 4 months. Most of the buildings in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed. Most of the Strip's hospitals are no longer functioning. Women cannot safely give birth, and children undergo amputations without anesthesia. While Israel has systematically destroyed the Strip and driven the Palestinians into famine, the White House has refused to pool the billions in military support the U.S. provides to Tel Aviv. Although the Washington claims is pressuring Israel to take a more targeted military approach, a review of satellite images by The Guardian shows Israel's operations have destroyed most of the infrastructure in the north and south of Gaza, making it uninhabitable for the millions of Palestinians that live there. All right, next up here from Al Jazeera, mass grave of handcuffed and blindfolded Palestinians unearthed in Gaza. Al Jazeera reports Palestinian authorities have demanded an international investigation after the mass grave was found in Gaza with decomposing bodies of Palestinian detainees who were blindfolded and handcuffed. At least 30 bodies were found in black plastic bags near the Hamed school in northern Gaza, with Palestinian officials accusing Israeli soldiers of killing the civilians execution style. Witnesses told Al Jazeera that the deceased were blindfolded, tortured, and killed before being placed in the black bags. All right, next up, judge asks White House to review unconditional support for Israel. So last week, there's 2 kind of legal things that were going on over the past couple of weeks. One was the ICJ ruling, which found that Israel was plausibly carrying out a genocide in Gaza and asked Israel to stop conducting the genocide, to hold its officials accountable, including Prime Minister Netanyahu, have called for the genocide of the Palestinian people and to allow aid into the Gaza Strip, something that Israel and its main backer in the U.S. have completely ignored and dismissed, even though there was an American judge on that court who did rule that Israel was plausibly committing a genocide and gave those orders to Israel. But at the same time, there was this case in Oakland, California, that kind of surprisingly was allowed to progress even to some preliminary phases. And so we now have the result of that trial. And look, I never thought that, some federal judge in Oakland or any lawsuit brought by Americans would ever be able to actually rule and order the White House cannot provide these arms to Israel, cannot provide support to Israel, that the U.S. has to, like, say, enforce the Leahy laws or something like that and can't provide arms to Israel. That's not going to happen. Biden is able to wage war, proxy wars in Ukraine, wars across the Middle East with no congressional authorization whatsoever. So at least when it comes to the, presidential powers, we really are post-Constitution. However, I think this adds to the case, that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. The number of U.S. officials who have essentially, ruled that what the U.S. is doing at least amounts to a real problem and really needs to be reevaluated, and just gives more ammunition to the pro-Palestinian movement to try to pressure the White House to end this unconditional support for Gaza. So this is from Common Dreams, and I believe it's Jack Johnson who reports a federal judge in Oakland, California dismissed a lawsuit Wednesday that aimed to stop the U.S. from aiding Israel's catastrophic assault on the Gaza Strip, but offered sharp criticism for the Biden administration's unwavering support for the war. U.S. Judge Jeffrey White of the Northern District of California ruled that the suit brought by Palestinian rights organizations and individuals in the U.S. and in Gaza falls outside of the court's limited jurisdiction and must be rejected on technical grounds. White described the case as a rare instance in which he preferred the outcome is inaccessible to the court, but pointed to the International Court of Justice's finding that South Africa's genocide case brought against Israel is plausible, and suggested the U.S. government should reconsider its role in supporting the assault on Gaza. Both the uncontroverted testimony of the plaintiffs and the expert opinion proffered at the hearing on these motions, as well as statements made by various officers of the Israeli government, indicate that the ongoing military siege of Gaza is intended to eradicate the whole people and therefore plausibly falls within the international prohibition against genocide, White wrote. So again, all the claims that you want to say that, anybody who supports the Palestinians are just anti-Semitic. Here you have a, sitting U.S. judge ruling that Israel is plausibly committing a genocide. He continued, it is every individual's obligation to confront the current siege in Gaza, but also this court's obligation to remain within the merits and bounds of its jurisdictional scope. This court implores defendants to examine the results of their unflagging support for the military siege against the Palestinian people in Gaza. Now, unfortunately, Biden won't listen to this, but I think all of that is really important that we have this U.S. judge saying it. Now, Congress certainly isn't listening. House to vote on $17.6 billion new military aid bill for Israel. This really hurts as an American to think that our government is actually going to step up support for Israel as they're in the midst of carrying out a genocide that's widely understood to be a genocide, that Israeli officials have expressly called for and admitted that this is a genocide. And here we're going to increase our support to Israel by sixfold here. Unbelievably disgusting. So the White House will vote this week to provide the House will vote this week to provide $17.6 billion in new military aid to Israel to support the mass killings of Palestinians in Gaza. The House previously passed a $14.3 billion resolution for Israel, but cut funds to the Internal Revenue Service the IRS, so that it didn't receive any supports for Democrats and was never brought to the Senate for a floor vote. The new bill adds over $3 billion for Israel and does not include spending cuts. Over in the Senate, negotiators reached a bill on a border policy to advance through a behemoth $110 billion bill that includes military aid for Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan. More on that in a minute. So, House Speaker Mike Johnson said on Saturday, their leadership is aware that by failing to include the House in their negotiations, that they have eliminated their ability for swift consideration of any legislation. Next week, we will take up and pass a clean standalone Israel supplemental package. According to the House Appropriations Committee, the $17.6 billion bill includes funding to replenish Israel's missile systems, provide Israel with advanced weapon systems, and procure more bombs and artillery shells. It also provides funding to replenish U.S. stockpiles of weapons that have already been sent to Israel. The $17.6 billion is on top of $3.8 billion Israel receives from the U.S. each year. The U.S. has also shipped huge amounts of munitions and other weapons to support the slaughter in Gaza, which has killed over 27,000 Palestinians, including 11,500 children. The International Court of Justice ruling that is plausible Israel is committing a genocide has not deterred U.S. support. According to Ynet, over 25,000 tons of U.S. weapons have been delivered to Israel since October 7th. All right, so now let's talk about the Senate bill a little bit. Senate unveils $118 billion bill with military with money for Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, and new Yemen war. So this from Dave DeCamp, antiwar.com, February 4th. The Senate Appropriations Committee on Sunday unveiled a massive $118 billion spending bill that will include military aid for Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, as well as spending for President Biden's new war with Yemen's Houthis, which is something that I had reported, but I discussed on the show. There was a Politico report about 2 weeks ago that said they would include the Yemen funding in this bill. The bill is a result of months of negotiations between Senate Democrats and Republicans on border policies, including $20 billion in border spending, but some Republicans are unhappy with the agreement and seek more stringent border policies. House Speaker Mike Johnson rejected the deal and said he would bring a standalone aid bill for Israel to the House floor this week. The Senate bill would authorize $60 billion to spend on the proxy war in Ukraine, $4.8 billion to support regional partners in the Indo-Pacific, a portion of which will go towards replenishing arms sent to Taiwan. The U.S. has also sold weapons to Taiwan since severing diplomatic relations with Taipei in 1979, but the U.S. never financed the purchase of or provided the arms for free of charge through military aid until last year. The bill also provides $2.44 billion to Central Command to address combat expenditures related to the combat in the Red Sea, where U.S. naval forces have been bombing Yemen and downing Houthi drones and missiles. Since January 12th, the U.S. has bombed Yemen at least 16 times, and I believe there was one more this morning that CENTCOM reported, so that's going to be 17, and the situation in the region continues to escalate as the Houthis are not backing down. All right, next up here, this was interesting. There's a Wall Street Journal article with Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is Israel's national security minister, one of the most aggressive, genocidal Israeli ministers and members of the Israeli government that there are. And, he has openly, called for, was dancing and celebrating at a conference that called for the complete resettlement of Gaza by Israelis, which means, of course, eliminating the Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. And here you have a profile of him on the Wall Street Journal, and it's almost, the headline almost here reminds me of the initial obituary for Baghdadi, the ISIS leader. The Israeli firebrand driving Netanyahu further to the right is how they headline this story. So that's pretty disgusting. It should be the Israeli firebrand openly calling for genocide or something like that. So, anyways, in his interview, he said, instead of giving us his full backing, Biden is busy with giving humanitarian aid and fuel to Gaza, which goes to Hamas. If Trump was in power, the U.S. conduct would be completely different. So, two things. One, he's mad that there's some fuel going into Gaza, which for the White House is, I think, really important to their PR, to their base, to pretend like this isn't just a U.S. blanket support for a genocide. And so to criticize Biden for that is shocking. But then also to say that Biden isn't giving Israel his full backing because he's called for Israel to curtail the operations a little bit and to give the Palestinians in Gaza some aid is absolutely absurd. And I'm not sure I agree with them either, that this comment that if Trump was in power, the U.S. conduct would be completely different. In fact, I think if Trump was in power, the U.S. conduct may be more restrained. First of all, I think at least the liberal media would be highlighting the death of most of the Palestinian children and weaponizing that against Trump. And I think they would have pressured Trump into maybe it's pushing some red lines on Israel as far as how many children you could kill, what percentage of buildings of Gaza you could destroy. I mean, this is a World War II level annihilation campaign of Gaza, comparable to what the Allies did to Japanese or German cities during World War II, when you look at the level of destruction. And I really think that Trump would have been pressured. I don't think he really cares about the Palestinians. I'm not saying that. But I think Trump would have been pressured into, basically putting in some red lines on how far Israel could go. And look at the way you have Israeli officials talking about the U.S. as we talk about giving them $20 billion in military aid this year. They're saying, oh, we don't give, the U.S. doesn't give Israel enough backing, and makes criticisms of the United States. Well, I don't think Trump would stand for that. If Ben Gvir made this comment when Trump was president, he would force the Israeli government to apologize or would cut the Israeli aid over it. I'm not saying that's necessarily a better president or anything like that, but I don't think Trump's ego would let him be walked all over by Israeli officials like Biden has allowed himself to be. All right, one more story here on the the Israel situation. Secretary of State Antony Blinken returns to the Middle East. So he arrived, it should be on Sunday. It says he will make stops in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Qatar, Israel, and the West Bank Sunday through Thursday. This isn't going to help anything. None of his trips have helped anything, but we're going to be seeing stories about all week. Maybe some reports we'll discuss. It may just be that his complete and utter lack of being able to be a diplomat may make this trip completely irrelevant. All right. So this one, February 3rd, antiwar.com, U.S. strikes in Iraq and Syria kill about 40, including civilians. A massive U.S. bombing campaign struck scores of targets in Iraq and Syria with over 100 bombs, leaving about 40 people dead, including civilians. President Joe Biden ordered the strikes as tensions in the Middle East are rapidly escalating. On Friday, U.S. Central Command announced the U.S. military struck more than 85 targets with numerous aircraft, including long-range bombers, flown from the United States. The airstrikes employed more than 125 precision munitions. On Saturday, Baghdad reported that 16 Iraqis, including civilians, were killed. The UK-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights claimed that the Syrian strikes had killed 23 militia fighters. The Syrian Defense Ministry said militants and civilians were killed, but did not provide a figure. Baghdad and Damascus issued statements blasting Washington over the strikes. Last week, 3 American soldiers were killed in Jordan near the Syrian border with a drone. Biden vowed to respond to the deaths of American troops in the Middle East by striking Iranian-linked targets in the Middle East. The White House did not seek congressional authorization for starting the war. Additionally, the White House admitted that it could not directly link Tehran to the strike in Jordan. It does not appear that any Iranians were killed by U.S. forces on Friday. In a separate incident, one Iranian officer was reported killed in Syria, likely by an Israeli airstrike that took place before the American attack. The National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby said the strikes were aimed at de-escalating tensions in the region. However, the Islamic Resistance of Iraq conducted retaliatory strikes the next day against U.S. bases housing against bases housing U.S. soldiers, and we will get into that right here. This is another article I wrote for antiwar.com. Iraqi bases housing U.S. soldiers attacked following U.S. strikes on militias in Iraq and Syria. Following the attacks on dozens of sites across Iraq and Syria, the Islamic resistance of Iraq announced it attacked bases that house U.S. soldiers. Last week, 3 American soldiers in Jordan near the Syrian border were killed by a drone. The White House blamed Iran for an attack, a charge Iran denies. Pentagon Press Secretary Sabrina Singh admitted that Washington had no evidence Iran directed the attack. Still, the Biden administration leaked to the press that the president would order strikes against Iranian targets in the Middle East without seeking congressional authorization. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said Thursday that it doesn't matter if Iran directed the attack. Austin said, we believe that this was done by an element that is known as the Axis of Resistance, and these are Iranian proxy groups. And how much Iran knew or didn't know, we don't know, but it really doesn't matter because Iran sponsors these groups. Without evidence or approval from Congress, Biden ordered the first round of strikes on Friday. U.S. Central Command reported on the damage. Members of Shia militia groups in Iraq and Syria were killed. However, at the time, it appears no Iranians died in the strikes, and civilians were killed as well. In his statement on the strikes, Biden said he was planning additional waves of attacks. He said, this afternoon, at my discretion, the U.S. military forces struck targets at facilities in Iraq and Syria that the IRGC and affiliated militias used to attack U.S. forces. Our response began today. It will continue at times and places of our choosing. The Iraqi government blasted the U.S. for new aggression against its sovereignty. This aggressive airstrike will put the security in Iraq and in the region on the brink of abyss, Baghdad said. Damascus was also outraged. The Syrian Defense Ministry called the strikes aggression of the American occupation forces, which it said were attempting to weaken the ability of the Syrian Arab Army and its allies in the field of fighting terrorism. Shia militias in Iraq and Syria began attacking U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria in mid-October. The umbrella organization for Shia militias that operate in the region, the Islamic Resistance of Iraq, said that the attacks were an effort to pressure Israel to end the onslaught in Gaza. U.S. troops had come under fire over 150 times before the 3 soldiers were killed in Jordan. The U.S. has conducted several airstrikes in Iraq and Syria in response to the hundreds of attacks that often cause no or only minor damage or injuries to the bases or to American soldiers. However, the strikes were far more limited than the massive bombing campaign on Friday. National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby claimed that the attack was an effort to de-escalate tensions in the Middle East. He said, the signal is the attacks on American forces occupying Iraq and Syria. I added that. He was unclear there, so I added the on American forces occupying Iraq and Syria have to stop. The attacks have to stop. So the signal is to Iran and these groups, the attacks have got to stop. These are responses. The response began tonight. They're not going to end tonight, so there will be additional responses. There will be additional action that we will be taking. This really suggests more waves of airstrikes, and the way all the officials worded it, I assume that's the case, but they didn't, I guess, explicitly say that. The White House has frequently asserted that its actions in the Middle East since October have been at de-escalating tensions. However, attacking militias in Iraq and Syria or the Houthis in Yemen have only caused further escalations. Al Jazeera reported on Saturday that the Al-Tanaf and Al-Assad bases were targeted in Iraq. The Islamic Resistance of Iraq announced it attacked the American operations in Hadari base in Erbil with drones. Washington has not commented on the alleged attacks. In Yemen, the White House has ordered over a dozen waves of bombing against the Houthis in under 3 weeks. The strikes have escalated the attacks from the Houthis, according to CENTCOM. Yemeni forces conducted multiple rounds of attacks on vessels in the Red Sea on Friday. And it seems like, at least since probably last Thursday, there's been multiple rounds of attack most days, but at least one attack every single day. And so certainly what the Houthis are doing is upticking their operations in the region. While Biden has bombed 3 countries in response to the escalating tensions in the Middle East, the White House has refused to condition the U.S. aid that it provides to Israel to pressure Tel Aviv to relent in Gaza. The U.S. maintains significant leverage over Israel and has pressured Tel Aviv to end previous wars on the Strip, but Biden shows no interest in doing that this time. All right, last article today, this one from antiwar.com, Dave DeCamp. Jade Sullivan refuses to rule out U.S. airstrikes inside of Iran. So National Security Advisor Jade Sullivan said Sunday that he refused to rule out direct U.S. attacks inside Iran while discussing the widespread bombing of that the U.S. launched in Iraq and Syria on Friday. Appearing in CNN's State of the Union, Sullivan signaled the bombing campaign was not over, saying the U.S. is planning more actions. When asked if the U.S. had ruled out attacks on Iranian territory, he said, "Look, saying on national TV program, I'm not going to rule in or rule out any activities anywhere." Which, if the U.S. was really aimed at de-escalating this situation, that might have been a good thing to actually rule out on national TV, but that's not the case. The U.S. launched the strikes in response to the drone attack that killed 3 U.S. troops on a small base in Jordan near the Syrian border. The U.S. blamed Iran for the attack because it armed Shia militias the U.S. believes were responsible, but acknowledges it has no evidence Tehran was involved. When announcing the strikes, U.S. Central Command said it targeted the Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps Quds Force and affiliated militia groups. Direct U.S. attacks on Iranian personnel risk provoking a major war with Iran, but so far there's no indication the U.S. bombing killed any Iranians. In Iraq, the Popular Mobilization Forces said 16 of its members were killed in the strikes. The PMF is a coalition of Iraqi militias that formed in 2014 to fight the Islamic State. The PMF is officially a part of Iraq's security forces and fought on the side of the U.S. in major battles against ISIS during the war, against ISIS in Iraq. In Syria, unconfirmed reports say 23 people were killed. The Syrian government said some soldiers and some civilians were killed, but did not give a specific number. Sullivan was asked if the U.S. strikes killed any member of the IRGC. He said, "We are still assessing the battle damage. Our CENTCOM Central Command is looking at the capabilities we have reduced and the casualties that were incurred." Sullivan also claimed the U.S. does not seek a wider war in the region, even as it bombs Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, and continues to bat the Israeli slaughter in Gaza. All right, everybody, that's the show for today. A lot coming up this week. So today, Monday, February 5th, I will be back on with our good friend Misty Winston on the Misty Winston Show, TNT Radio. That's 5 p.m. Eastern time. And then, if you don't catch it live, they do post it after. And I have a couple interviews coming up this week. Connor Freeman, co-host, will be back on the show tomorrow, and a lot of other great stuff. So keep an eye on the Institute and my Twitter feed at @KyleAnzalone_. Thanks, everyone.